of its respective identity.
So I think we're going to press the start button. We're going to begin this evening's proceedings. And I've got the pleasure of introducing Dr. Kelsey Granger, yes, who's going to be talking to us about the topic that's on the screen, A Tomb of One's Own. I want to just, though, fill in maybe unnecessary added detail, but for the record, I think, need to recognise and congratulate Kelsey for having won the 2023 George Staunton Prize, which is a prize given, for the best article in the journal in a given year for a early career scholar, which is what Kelsey still is. Yes.
Yes.
I think you got your PhD probably last year. No, sorry, year before last. I haven't quite caught up with 2024 yet. And you received a doctorate from the University of Cambridge. You're now based in Munich as an Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow, which is great. It's so good when people can move on to a postdoc, so congratulations there. I won't talk about what you're doing for the postdoc because I don't want to kind of preempt anything that you might be saying at all in this talk, but just to congratulate you again and say that we're just really pleased that you've been able to come and speak to us this evening. That's like, come on through.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone that's joining in person and those joining on Zoom. So my name is Dr. Kelsey Granger. I'm currently a Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, but it's great to be back in the UK to give this talk today. I'm really delighted to have received the Sir George Staunton Prize for my recent article on dogs in early Chinese tombs. Most of all, since I'm still a very early career scholar, I only defended my doctorate late in 2022, but also because this article was the result of a single footnote gone wild. Rather than being a premeditated and considered contribution to the field, this article began as a simple backdrop to my doctoral study of lapdog keeping in Tang and Song Dynasty China. It was supposed to be just a single paragraph outlining what roles dogs played in Chinese social history prior to the arrival of the pampered lapdog in the mid-7th century. In the end, this one paragraph sprawled to over 12,000 words, countless images of ceramic dog figurines clogged up my computer, and most of all, I had a desire to share my findings with equally enthused scholars who wouldn't mind the unpalatable topic of death. So today, I'm first going to briefly talk about my doctoral thesis and why I even began looking at dogs in Chinese history. Then I'll summarize the varied roles dogs played in pre-imperial China before honing in on the tomb, and in particular, the long-standing relationship that dogs shared with these spaces. We'll close by looking at several stories of lassie come home style heroics and how some dogs came to acquire a tomb of one's own. So, why did I decide to dedicate 4 years of my life to intensely studying lapdogs in Tang and Song Dynasty China? While I could give a very succinct summation of how pets are shaped by and indeed channel social and emotional history and are the new frontier in studies of humanities overlooked thus far in sinology, the answer for me was actually far more straightforward. Oh, this is where the controls are not gonna work. There we go. I was inspired to explore the topic of lapdogs for a very simple reason: my own beloved lapdog, Birdie, who was a Japanese chin. The breed is reported to have been traded between the Tang and Japanese courts, which made me curious about the imperial legacy of modern-day breeds like the Japanese chin, Pekingese, and Pug. While I initially started my thesis hoping to trace the origins of Tang lapdogs out across the Silk Roads, I ended up becoming far more interested in how people wrote about these little dogs. Lapdog keeping became a veritable vogue among elite women, as shown by the selection of visual sources here. The lapdog's close association, not only with women, but with the female areas of the home, meant they became a key element of Tang erotic poems and paintings, signifying access to intimate female chambers. It became quite clear during the course of my doctoral research that these small dogs, often termed as wo in the textual sources, were an entirely new type of animal. Firstly, they appear very suddenly in the textual and visual records of China. There were no prior depictions of such dogs, and Tang ceramics and murals founded highly standardized models for depicting lapdogs without seemingly any trial or error, or any major divergences between the depictions. Secondly, these lapdogs were only ever pictured with women or with children, which had also not been seen before with any other animal. It would seem that these diminutive dogs arrived in China within a neatly pre-packaged set of portable standardized art models and explanations concerning the dog's function, i.e. being primarily for aesthetic and entertainment purposes. Alongside later textual references that describe the lapdogs as being Iranian or Sogdian in origin, the earliest dated record of lapdogs discusses the tribute of two small dogs from afar. The following is quoted from Tongdian, though there are near identical records of this act of tribute in Qiutangshu, Xintangshu, Cefuyuangui, and Taiping Yulan. So in the Wude reign period of the Great Tang Dynasty, Gao Chang, or Turfan, sent an envoy to give a male and female dog as tribute, with each being 7.2 inches tall and over 12 inches long. Their character was very docile, and they could lead horses by the rein and hold a torch in their mouths. It is said they were originally born in the kingdom of Fulin. This pair of dogs appeared to be the first lapdogs recorded in Chinese history, identifiable by their small size and their ability to perform tricks. Unfortunately, we can only trace the origins of Tang lapdogs out as far as Turfan, who gave the dogs in tribute, with there being no trace of lapdogs along the Silk Road trade routes between Turfan and further west. This means we have no way of proving whether the dogs really came from Fulin, which was largely understood as Byzantium or Antioch. In many ways, it's more likely that this assertion was simply reflective of the dogs coming from somewhere far away. This exoticism mattered, with the dogs continuing to be associated with foreign treasures like gold, glass, tortoiseshell, rare parrots, and magic throughout the Tang dynasty. So to summarize, lapdogs arrived suddenly from afar, likely in the mid-7th century, and were understood, even pre-packaged within the context of exotica, prestige, aesthetics, femininity, and entertainment. This was an entirely different context to other exotic hounds that were also imported at the time. So Salukis, which you can see here, much like the greyhounds before them in the Han Dynasty, were also imported from further west in the 7th century. However, while still being prestigious, Salukis were invariably situated within the elite sport of hunting, and also always positioned with a foreign or Han Chinese man in tomb iconography. While pondering on these differences, I began to question why the idea of a lapdog had not taken hold much earlier, and whether there were traces of a nascent pet culture in pre-Tang China. This then drew me to consider the long social history of dogs from pre-imperial China all the way down to the mid-7th century. For starters, I grappled with the work of Victorian dog fanciers who traced the lineage of lapdogs back into the Shang and even pre-Shang periods, asserting that every emperor from time immemorial, without question, had his palace dogs. This romantic notion is unfortunately easily disproved. Small dogs certainly existed in the textual and visual records. These were not discernible lapdogs. They were instead hunting terriers. Once I had righted this wrong, I should have left well enough alone. But curiosity got the best of me. What then did dogs do in the pre-imperial period? The answer, it turns out, was to be buried an awful lot. Dogs are known to have been in close proximity with humans for millennia in China, with the domestication of the dog in the region of modern-day China predating the 5th millennia BC. Dogs were one of several domesticated animals alongside oxen, sheep, goats, horses, and chickens that were kept for sustenance, sacrifice, and labor, here being hunting, herding, and guarding. All these animals could be sacrificed and buried in relation to the construction of human tombs, but dogs shared a particularly long-lived association with tombs and the wider subject of death than other animals mentioned. So too did their relationship and role within the tomb change significantly across the Han and post-Han period, a phenomenon yet to be noted by scholarship. Further west, burials of dogs were also subject to reinterpretation in the context of ancient Greece, with Leslie Day arguing that the changes in the treatment of dogs after death suggest something about their position while alive. While it's difficult to directly apply the situation of one culture neatly onto another, the theory that the treatment of an animal after its death may inform us about its life, value, or function certainly applies here. By analysing the placement of the dog in relation to the tomb, we can better trace changes in the conceptualization of dogs in life as well as in death. So too does this shed light on wider changes to the concept of death and the afterlife. Here I'll summarise the changes to dogs in burials and burials of dogs across early China, before highlighting what these changes tell us about wider Chinese social history. To avoid stumbling back too far into the Neolithic period and beyond, I will start my survey of dogs in Chinese history with the Shang period of circa 1600 to 1046 BC, a civilization that has yielded rich archaeological findings and troves of inscribed oracle bones. The subject of dogs in pre-imperial and particularly Shang period China is remarkably well studied. It could not fail to be, since dogs turn up everywhere. We should consider this phase as being a baseline, as it were, to which we can compare later phases. However, the phases I mention are in no ways fixed and instead ought to be conceived of as a messy transition or spectrum that was far from linear. In this phase, incorporating part of the subsequent Western Zhou period of 1045 to 771 BC, the dog was a ritual accessory that was sacrificed and buried in relation to the construction of a human's tomb. While we know dogs were used in royal hunts from oracle bone records, zooarchaeological evidence from the Shang period largely presents fragmentary, slaughtered or dismembered dog remains in three contexts: in waste deposits resulting from sacrificial or ordinary consumption, buried in ritual pits likely related to the ceremonial consecration of buildings, and buried in relation to human-occupied tombs. On the first point, dogs could be sacrificed and consumed, much like other livestock animals, but remains from both ordinary and sacrificial consumption alike would both end up in general waste deposits, so it can be challenging to ascertain how common either practice involving dog meat really was. One cache of Shang oracle bones suggests dogs were not often used as sacrificial victims in a royal context, interpreted by scholars as implying that either they were very highly regarded or they were not highly regarded at all. Analysis of oracle bones describing the situations that required dog sacrifice suggests that this practice was enacted as part of ancestral worship or in relation to the cardinal directions or associated with the winds. While dogs may have been sacrificed in certain ceremonies more so than in others, in totality, they were one of a range of domesticated animals raised for consumption and sacrifice in the Shang period. The dog had more overtly identifiable roles in the construction and consecration of buildings and tombs. Many animals were sacrificed during the construction of tombs, with royal tombs often incurring large-scale stacking of multiple animals in satellite pits surrounding the tomb. The scale of ritualized destruction for some of the royal tombs, especially those found in Anyang, is astounding, involving hundreds of animals and human sacrifices. Again, the dog features as one of many possible victims, though perhaps sharing a slightly stronger connection with thresholds than other animals. The one role which seems to have been unique to dogs was burial in the waste pit or being placed on the ledge that was found in the tomb chamber. So the waste pit, or yaokeng, was essentially a pit that was dug underneath the waist of the deceased, as you can see in this diagram here. As Roderick Campbell has noted with regards to finds at Anyang, humans and dogs could both be positioned in these waste pits, on tomb ledges and in associated tomb fill. With a noteworthy increase in the presence of dogs rather than humans in the waste pits and tombs of smaller burials, he asserts that dogs could even substitute humans in certain contexts. For Shang tombs, approximately 50% of dog skeletons were placed in waste pits, 30% in the ceremonial pits, and only 20% on the ledges in the smaller burials. Equally, half of the waste pits at Anyang, a feature which occurred in about 60% of tombs, were empty, suggesting that the function of the yaokeng could be accomplished merely by its existence. What demarcates dogs in this context is the treatment of the canine body. Instead of being dismembered and or stacked with multiple victims, as in the ceremonial pits or tomb fill, quite often the dog's body was fully preserved in these waste pits. So you can see some examples of dogs in waste pits here. So the preservation of the dog's body suggests it was intended to serve the deceased in the next life as part of their retinue. When a human appears in the yaokeng with a dog, which doesn't happen too often, they're usually armed, which is suggestive of hunting or warfare. This has led many scholars to interpret the function of the dog here as a tomb guardian, needed to protect the deceased from threats, either within the tomb or on the passage to the next life. Arguments have also been made here for the continued association of the dog with the four directions and the wind in these waste pits, either in terms of geomancy or for exorcising evil winds. The placement of dogs on the tomb ledge has equally been understood as perhaps marking the dog as a companion in death, so a beloved dog owned in life accompanying their owner in death. The argument for this is challenged by the findings of Li Zhepeng and Roderick Campbell, wherein many of the Shang dogs interred at Anyang were actually juvenile puppies, so unlikely to actually have been the dogs kept by the individual. This suggests that these dogs were raised to be sacrificed, and so killing a juvenile puppy means you're spending a lot less resources on raising a dog that's ultimately going to be killed. Of course, there might have been a ritual significance to burying the puppies that we don't yet know. So if the dogs, or especially those on the tomb ledge, were not companions in death, then what were they? Clearly, Shang ritual culture associated the dogs strongly with the tomb, especially given the fact that while other domestic animals could be used in sacrifice and tomb consecration ceremonies, they rarely, if ever, replaced the dog in the context of the Yaokong. It's difficult without explanatory text from this time period to be sure why humans from the Shang heartland singled out the dog for this ritual purpose, nor what they felt such an interment so close to the deceased body actually signified. The subsequent Western Zhou period, for instance, saw acute regional differences in the use of Yaokong, with new adaptations emerging. Western Zhou tombs at Pudongcun in Chang'an all included items in the pit alongside the dog skeleton, likely reflecting alterations to the associated ritual practice or ceremony that accompanied the burial of the dog under the tomb. Equally, other regional areas have little to no attested Yaokong. The continued uneven distribution is thus reflective of the adoption, adaptation, and discarding of wider ritual practices, as well as the dog's role therein. So, while covering an exceedingly long span of time, and despite showing regional incongruencies, Shang and Western Zhou sites tie the dog to the tomb as a ritual accessory. Beyond the roles dogs shared with other sacrificial animals, whether they were intended to act as a guardian, appeaser of the winds, or a sacrifice consecrating the tomb, the dog was a core part of the ritual furniture of the tomb and its associated ceremonies. So far, this is all well-trodden ground in academia, summarized here without all of the necessary terms and conditions apply, but easily accessible in more detail across a number of articles and even state-of-the-field reviews. As a ritual accessory, the dog's life and death were given meaning and significance by humans in the context of burials, though as stated, the exact interpretations of the Yaokong dog is not clear. In any case, these were not beloved dogs owned in life, but were raised specifically for sacrifice or consumption. The more abstract relationship that Shang adherents thus shared with these dogs has often meant the dogs are simply interpreted as mute, inanimate objects. But the subsequent Han era provides much more replete textual information that can furnish our understanding of dogs in tombs. However, the stark transformation of the dog's role in tombs during this timeframe has gone largely unnoticed in sinology. As we will see, representations of dogs and actual dog skeletons were altered alongside wider societal shifts, which otherwise would not be so clear. This phase is underpinned by the themes of ownership and dominion, as seen through the burial of dog figurines and dog bodies alike. So the dog was no exception to this overarching filtration of substitute miniature figurines, or in other words, a move towards miniaturization, reduction, and replacement in mortuary practices. This started in the late Shang period onwards, but the transition from sacrifice to figurine is difficult to trace, as the very materiality of these figurines means theoretically few have survived. The famous reference to straw dogs, for instance, highlights the perishable materials early figurines could be made from. Equally, the increased use of figurines was not a change that occurred overnight, nor did it necessarily involve the total replacement of burying physical dogs from the late Shang period onwards. Despite evidence of grave goods substitutes emerging in the late Shang period, according to Elaine Thote, it was during the Eastern Zhou period that the contents of the tomb truly began to resemble visual documents of life. This had matured by the Han Dynasty, and as Armin Selbichka's analysis has shown, these grave goods were intended to furnish the deceased for a perpetual afterworld that was imagined inside of tombs. So by the turn of the 1st century, there were two coinciding motivations for the use of grave goods. The first being related to nourishing the dead, so sustenance, and the second was substituting, specifying, and enlarging the palette of people, animals, and items that could be included in the tomb. So figurines of people are identified as being specific kinds of people that would not usually be interred as sacrificial victims, including named family members, for instance. So we can see, for instance, dancers in tombs, we have attendants in tombs, and we also have games like Liubo in action in tombs. For sustenance, there would be models of stoves, animal figurines, and food vessels. While earlier food vessels might be identical to those used in life, crude clay substitutes that were often simple, small, and generic began to replace these real-life productions. So what about dogs in this context? Across the span of the Han Dynasty, crude representations of dogs could sometimes be included among other basic figurines of domestic animals. This perhaps reflects the continued use of the dog as a food source, presenting the dog as a parallel to other livestock animals. Indeed, rubbings like this one in the Han Dynasty shows a dog hung from a well sweep. It's not really clear at first. This is a whole kitchen scene. You can see here the dog is hung up and the guy next to him has a knife. We can kind of tell what's going to happen. This kind of scene is seen quite a lot in Western Han tombs, particularly from like Shandong region. This is a very repeated motif. We can also see here a Western Han figurine of a dog stood by a stove, which is a little bit ominous. While the use of animal figurines to represent sustenance in the tomb is perhaps a Han-specific development, this doesn't really range that far from the burial of scores of animals in the satellite pits that surrounded the pre-imperial tombs. The dog was once again positioned as one of a range of animals raised for sustenance. We can therefore class rubbings depicting dog slaughter and crude ceramics of dogs by cooking equipment or among groups of other livestock animals as being intended to nourish the deceased. The turn of the 1st century ushered in changes both to the structure of tombs themselves, which became multi-chambered and more architecturally complex, but also a burgeoning range of ceramic architectural buildings, including workshops and multi-chambered residents being placed in tombs. What had once been simple and generic animal pens, essentially a bowl with an animal figure in the middle, or just a simple animal figurine on its own, became complex and detailed renderings of real buildings. So here we can see a well, a large multi-storied house, and an animal pen that's full of goats, tended to by a mother with an infant in her arms. These trappings rendered the tomb an accurate microcosm of owned property and life. There are also watchtowers, dye shops, and many other industries represented in extant ceramics. Tomb inscriptions accompanying some of these architectural figures describe the imagined incomes these veritable ceramic estates would earn for the deceased in perpetuity. These grave goods provided both imagined sustenance and income equivalent to a real estate, reflecting the expanding scale of private estates amassed by tomb occupants in this period. So in the 1st century CE, the social and economic status of the deceased could be accurately rendered in miniature inside of the tomb. At the same time, we see what even today remains an astounding number of ceramic dogs depicted barking and wearing a harness. These are really just a small selection of such figurines, which invariably feature among almost every major collection of Chinese art. In fact, the one to the far side is from the British Museum, so just down the road. Despite there being so many of these figurines, they're all remarkably similar. So here they're always glazed in a green pigment. The image here is just monochrome. And they either depict a closed-mouthed dog with pricked ears or an open-mouthed dog, often with folding ears. We can see the 2 barking dogs at the far ends, and in the middle, we have one with very staring eyes, and the other is snarling. Despite giving little indication of scale, the harness attests to the implied size and strength of these dogs. We can deduce, especially from the open-mouthed dogs that were likely barking, that these were intended to be guard dogs. Indeed, if we look closely at the harnesses, we can see that these are not only remarkably similar to each other, but also reflect other representations of harnessed and tethered dogs, as seen in this rubbing here. So this is clearly a defensive image of a guard dog, and could therefore potentially be misunderstood as encompassing the supposed guardian role of the once buried Yaokong dog. However, what was the Yaokong dog protecting? It would seem in the Shang and Western Zhou tombs that it was protecting the ritual space of the tomb, given its burial on the vertical axis, or given its placement directly below the deceased, that it was protecting the deceased personally. In Han tombs, however, this does not seem to be the case. So these ceramic dogs were not placed inside of a waste pit or Yaokong, so they must have had additional significance beyond substituting the waste pit dog that was once utilized for the guarding of the tomb, potentially. This phenomenon cannot be understood without considering the architectural buildings I mentioned earlier, since smaller ceramic dogs actually feature in many of them, suggesting these canine ceramics were part of this same transformation in the reconceptualization of the tomb as a means to evidence social and economic status. Building on this increasing trend to represent the deceased social persona and associated property in 1st century grave goods, I would argue that the ceramic dogs placed inside the tomb came to embody themes of ownership and dominion. So the eagle-eyed among you may have already spotted a dog in one of the architectural building scenes I showed earlier, repeated here and helpfully circled. There are also dogs outside the home in the upper left corner and inside the entrance to this small building or barn as well. In line with the increased range of domestic buildings seen in late Western Han and Eastern Han graves, Several architectural ceramics from this time period feature a guard dog thrown in front of an entrance, a very different placement to general livestock, which would normally be positioned at the rear of such buildings. As shown here, the dogs can be positioned lying down with their ears erect as if listening out for danger, or sat up with pricked ears. They also didn't necessarily only appear in domestic scenes, with the dog here being positioned outside of a 4-story granary from the tomb of a minor landowner from the late Western Han period. If these domestic scenes represent a miniaturized estate of the deceased, why are dogs so often added to the entrances of buildings, barns, and courtyards? Given that these scenes seek to recreate a working world in miniature, textual references to living dogs may make this placement much clearer. So beyond hunting, a topic we'll return to in due course, dogs were certainly used for guarding and ratting from at least the Zhou period onwards. I know you may have expected a cat to be here as the keen ratter of the Han period, but as this rubbing from a Han tomb and further textual references show, this was very much the domain of dogs. If you want to know more about cats, we have the expert in the audience right here. But for now, we move back to guarding. This was the role that really defined dogs, even more so than hunting. While seeking to define the term for dogs, gou, through homophony, the famous dictionary Shaw and Tiedza states, gou, or dog, means kou, knocking, guarding by means of knocking out breath and barking. Texts like Feng Su Tongyi also highlight the dog's talent at guarding, stating that it's often said that dogs can distinguish guest from host and are good at guarding and attending. Therefore, they are tethered at the 4 entrances to ward off thieves and robbers. Here, guarding is deemed to rely on the dog's ability to bark, as well as its sense of perception. So when dogs were positioned in real and miniature buildings, what exactly did they guard? I always think this analogy most neatly sums up what guard dogs were really guarding. This short extract from Discourses on Salt and Iron, or Yan Jie Lun, is really talking about securing border defenses, but uses the analogy of the guard dog to make the point. So now you don't fortify without, and yet wish to be safe within. This is like a household, not building walls, nor having a dog to bark at night and morning, blindly acting without care. A guard dog is seen to be as essential to defining and defending the boundaries of a household as walls are. Dogs were not only used to physically patrol private borders, but were also enmeshed in the very concept of security and peace within this context. There's a lot of quotes often about dogs didn't bark because there were no robbers and thieves, for instance. So this is this idea that peace means a dog does not bark. It's clear that the role of the dog within these domestic scenes is to protect the property of the deceased rather than necessarily the deceased directly. As private estates in the late Western Han period expanded, the imagined afterworld of the tomb was increasingly equipped to provide eternal self-generating sustenance, wealth, company, and luxuries for the deceased. A dog, essential for guarding such property, was thus placed in these miniature scenes to watch for danger. And we can surmise that the larger individual ceramic figurines must have fulfilled a similar function. In this second phase, then, the dog was no longer strictly protecting the ritual space of the tomb, and perhaps this function was entirely defunct. Instead, it was charged with guarding the property of the deceased, encompassing and indeed upholding the deceased's ownership, possession, and dominion over their imagined afterlife estates, just as they must have done in life. But what about actual dog skeletons that could be included in tombs? Several tombs from very high-standing individuals have been excavated that include dogs placed in the tomb in unusual ways. So this includes a female dog buried in its own wooden coffin, discovered in the tomb of Marquise Yi of Zheng. 2 dogs were also buried in extravagant golden collars in the tomb of the king of Zhongshan. The use of coffins and these elaborate collars attests to a marked individualization of the dogs in question, and thus makes it likely that the deceased really did own these dogs in life. Given that thus far the phenomenon is restricted to elite tombs, I would argue that these were likely prized hunting hounds. One thing we know an awful lot about would be hunting, which was largely recorded for the royal clan in Shang times, but clearly hunting with dogs had spread to the wider populace by at least the Zhou period, if not earlier. Han rubbings show a range of dogs involved in hunting. So here we can see 2 stocky dogs that look like they're following a scent, so they might be scent hounds. And then the dog on the far side, this slim dog, is likely to be a greyhound or a sight hound. We also know that rulers often amassed menageries of fine hunting hounds, which could be presented as tribute from vassal states. So the last ruler of the Shang, Zhou Xin, is infamous for his debauchery and incessant collecting of prized hounds, horses, and other treasures. As much as this was framed as scandalous and inappropriate by the Zhou, they were guilty of similar feats. The famed tribute of the owl hound by the Lu tribe to the founder of the Zhou, King Wu, catalyzed a lengthy remonstrance against prizing exotics. But how can we be sure that the unusual dogs seen in the marquise and local kings' tombs were truly prized hunting hounds, especially without zoo archaeology and testing for the actual breed of the dog, for instance? But context suggests that these dogs were not ritually significant in the same way as the Yaokong dog was. The use of coffins and precious objects decorates the animals and redefines them as a prized possession or a prestige item. These dogs were not ritually significant, but were socially significant, embodying themes of dominion, being political dominion, expressed by the receipt of tribute and the collecting of exotics, and natural dominion, expressed by the decoration and taming of fierce hunting hounds and the very act of hunting itself. As I suggested when first discussing the Han Dynasty, there was a gradual transition to the use of figurines in place of sacrificial victims. Not only that, but in the 1st century CE, there was a marked shift towards architecturally complex tombs and grave goods that sought to replicate the property owned in life. A first aim was to nourish the deceased, as evidenced by ceramic farmsteads teeming with animals, cooking equipment, and depictions of cooking and slaughter. Dogs were included among other livestock animals, suggesting a continued role in the culinary arts. What is more striking, however, is the large-scale and continued production of standalone ceramic dog figurines, which wore harnesses and would bark, glare, or snarl. When contextualizing these alongside the architectural estates, it is clear that the dog was not a ritual accessory added during the consecration of the tomb, nor was it intended to defend the deceased personally. Instead, these dogs defended the property that was stored and amassed within the tomb, much as they did in life. At the same time, elite tombs could sometimes include actual dog bodies within the tomb chamber. Again, rather than being a continuation of the Yaokong dog, these dogs were highly individualized and thus likely to actually have been owned by the deceased personally. Given the high status of the deceased and the fact that these dogs possess all markers of inanimate prestige goods, these were likely to be prized hunting hounds, perhaps even imported from afar. The marked changes to the role of dogs in Han period tombs is emblematic of changing themes of dominion, ownership, and property within this time frame that in turn affected and shaped tomb iconography and associated items. So we now move to the final phase and arguably the biggest change in the relationship dogs shared with the tomb, how certain dogs acquired a tomb of one's own. This mostly covers the Han and post-Han period up to the 5th century or thereabouts, but to move forward, we need to take a step back and assess how and why dogs were buried after their own death rather than after a human's death. So the prized hunting hounds and sacrificial dogs all had deaths that were unnatural, timed with the consecration of the tomb or the burial of the deceased. But what happened when dogs died of natural causes? One option was just simply to consume the dog flesh. For instance, excavator slips from Shui suggest that encroaching hunting hounds killed by imperial park wardens could be eaten or boiled. Indeed, a metaphor that was used in the Shiji and Hanshu is often used to comment on the fate of loyal ministers who work tirelessly and are cast aside without thought. This is Zogou Peng, or the running dog is boiled. Two texts refer to the burial of dogs on their death. In the first case, which is taken from Yanzi Chunqiu, the advisor Yan Ying criticizes Duke Jing of Qi. The Duke wants to bury his running dog, which is likely a kind of greyhound that raced for sport. Not only that, but he wants to bury it in a coffin with funereal sacrifices. This is deemed as problematic for two reasons. First, the Duke is willing to lavish expenditures on an animal instead of on a human. Second is the farcical nature of the request, opening the Duke to ridicule. In the end, the Duke changes his mind and has the dog killed and eaten at a banquet. It's highly likely that this instance didn't really happen, but was a neat analogy to comment on frugality and propriety. Indeed, frugality is at the center of the second example, which is recorded in Li Ji. Confucius was said to have kept a dog, and on its death tells his followers that horses and dogs could be buried, but only in an economical way, such as by wrapping the body in worn cloth. As we will see in a moment, this phrasing overlaps with a later Han period memorial concerning the burial of dogs and horses. So this anecdote may be the result of later heavy Han era editing. But nevertheless, What both texts make clear is that dogs and horses operated on a different level to other animals. Secondly, if a dog really must be buried, it ought to be frugal. As I mentioned, received texts from the Han period suggested the topic of dog burial was briefly revisited and reassessed. A memorial by Gu Yong is recorded in Hanshul and predates his death early in the 1st century BCE. So here he states, since dogs and horses toil for humans, they ought to also have the repayment of a drape covering them after their death. This memorial suggests that the labor dogs and horses performed was the essential difference that allowed for their burial, as opposed to other domesticated animals. These burials were once again advocated to be frugal, simply involving the body being wrapped in cloth rather than necessitating coffins, tomb chambers, or ritual ceremonies. In the 1st century CE, Zheng Xuan also added commentary to the Li Ji and added his thoughts on the example of Confucius burying his dog with worn cloth. He defines the terms further by stating that the raised dog, or the dog raised by Confucius, was one trained to guard. A road horse is one ridden by a ruler or an upstanding gentleman. Jun goes a lot of ways. Other dogs and horses cannot be covered by a drape. In this commentary, the horse is specified as being owned by a Jun. In either case, whether you understand it as ruler or upstanding gentleman, it reinterprets the original Li Ji passage regarding burying a dog or horse as being restricted potentially to the elite and to specific animal functions as well, so being guarded and being ridden. Here it would seem that both specific acts of servitude and the owner's status were required to rightfully bury dogs and horses. We actually have evidence of only one known dog burial, which dates to the early 1st century CE. This simple grave pit, which was excavated in Yanliang, Shanxi, houses the remain of a small dog alongside 31 small figurines. You can see the bones clearly to the left, and then these kind of bowling pin-like figures, that's the ceramics that were added. The inclusion of these ceramics may be reflected of the master's status rather than affection for the dog if we apply the line given by Zheng Xuan. It would seem that across the 1st to 2nd centuries, there was a subtle shift regarding both how to bury dogs and horses and who should carry out such a practice. Unfortunately, there is scant archaeological material attesting to further dog-occupied tombs for us to assess how these debates were actualized, or the geographic spread, time frame, ubiquity of such burials. Would dog burials even be noticed by archaeologists, or would they be considered strange ceremonial pits? Nevertheless, the fact that such discussions even occurred heavily implies that people did bury their dogs. Text at least suggests that such a practice was allowable in recompense for a dog's labor, but it ought to be frugal, or at least in line with the master's social status somehow. Though there is a continued dearth of archaeological materials in the post-Han period, it's clear that attitudes towards burying dogs underwent a stark reconceptualization in this time frame. Anecdotes, specifically anomaly tales from the fall of the Han dynasty in the 3rd century onwards, tell of heroic and hellish dogs alike. These stories are a mixture of fiction, exaggeration, observation, and fact, intended to be believable but not necessarily totally grounded in reality. Some of these anecdotes position the dogs as a transgressive shapeshifter and whose powers were strongly associated with death. Such tales evidence that dogs retained a long-lived connection with the subject of death. They live in tombs, they transform into the recently deceased to eat offerings that were left at the tomb, or to sleep with the deceased wife. That's a really common one. They imitate the dead to interrupt filial devotion and cease offerings at a tomb, or they imitate a man who's away mourning to seduce his wife. There's a lot of wife seduction in these stories. This is counterbalanced by tales of heroic dogs that parallel, or even better, tales of loyal human servants, and which are ultimately rewarded with a tomb of their own. So the first heroic dog would be the swift hunting dog, Yellow Ears, as given in Shu Yi Ji, and even in the official history of the Jin Shu. Yellow Ears is owned by Lu Ji, who is stationed far from his hometown. When he grows homesick, he speaks to the dog and asks it to deliver a letter home, to which the dog responds with a hearty bark as if it understands human speech. Yellow Ears sets off on a long and perilous journey, communicating via barking to obtain crossing over lakes and rivers. Eventually, it finds its way to the correct village and successfully delivers the letter. Barking again, Yellow Ears thus prompts the family to write a letter in response, which the dog then swiftly carries back to its owner. When the dog later dies, Lu Ji has the dog buried near his hometown in a heaped burial mound that later becomes known locally as Yellow Ears' tomb. The second heroic dog is named Black Dragon. He's my favorite, who is owned by Li Xinchun. This Soushenzi account tells us the Black Dragon always accompanied his owner, and whenever Li Xinchun had a meal, he'd feed scraps to the dog. One day, Li Xinchun was drinking outside the city and grew inordinately drunk, falling asleep among the grass on his way home. The governor, Zheng Xia, was just then going out hunting, and when he saw the thick grass, he sent someone to torch it. Li Xinchun did not wake, but Black Dragon saw the wind blowing the fire towards them. It tried to tug at Li's clothes to no avail. There was a small stream nearby, which the dog ran to, drenched his fur, and ran back to his owner, shaking his fur to dampen the grass, just like in this picture. He did this several times, but then the dog collapsed from exhaustion and died. When Li came to, he saw Black Dragon was already dead and surmised from the dog's wet fur and the burnt grass around him what had happened. He was already sobbing when the governor saw him and said, "The gratitude of dogs is greater than that of humans. If humans do not know gratitude, are they really better than dogs?" He then ordered the dog be buried with an inner and outer coffin in burial clothes. This was then known as the Righteous Dog Tomb, which was over 33 meters tall. There's one third example, but it's a lot more boring, which is simply that a dog named Swan Grey was buried in a tomb after miraculously transforming into a dragon as part of a long-standing cycle of myths about King Boar, I think it is, of the region, but not as fun as Black Dragon. So all three of these tales tell of dogs being buried after performing monumental feats that involve the stereotypical canine skills of running, barking, shape-shifting. The burials are also much more extravagant, being large burial mounds in prominent spaces and involving coffins and clothes. These even become local landmarks. While we lack the archaeological evidence needed to ascertain whether post-Han burials were as extravagant in reality, it's clear that the logic underpinning these burials has matured and developed in the post-Han period. The tales of Yellow Ears and Black Dragon are underpinned by a strong moral undertone. Despite using canine skills to serve or save their owners, both dogs are driven by the same filial loyalty that was expected of human servants in relation to their master. Rather than a dog's simple labor for humans being deserving of recompense from its owner in the form of a very basic burial, here the dog's human, even superhuman morality makes it worthy of being buried. The extravagance of these burials mirrors the extravagance of these heroic moral feats, and the use of burial coffins and clothes further humanizes the dog. Indeed, as the governor's comments on the morality of dogs being superior to that of humans, and as Keith Knapp's recent art chapter has shown, post-Han accounts suggest that animals could be credited with a limited understanding of human morality when in direct relationships. So like mother and child, but not father and child, that's too abstract. I've only told here stories that result in a dog's burial, but many other stories tell of dogs protecting their owners, fighting would-be murderers to death, revealing a wife's scandalous affair, and rescuing their owners from house fires, traps, and assassins. But these burials, extravagant and humanized as they are, remain particularly moving aspects of these stories, laden with appreciation and grief. Instead of a frugal burial, these are extravagant. Instead of being basic and animalized, these are highly humanized. Instead of being limited to the top echelon of society, these are commissioned by more ordinary officials. And instead of being restricted by economic concerns, these burials were restricted more by emotional and moral concerns. So I started this talk at the very end of the story, talking about the sudden arrival of the pampered exotic lapdog in the mid-7th century. I postulated that this was the advent of pet keeping in China, catalyzed by trade with Central and Western Asia. But it did not suggest that this was also the advent of sentimentality concerning dogs. As has been seen, dogs could be much-loved companions, even if they were also working animals. When we look back at dogs across this exceedingly long span of time, their association with death and the tomb remains strikingly consistent and a large component of the many multivalent interpretations of dogs. Dogs could be good or bad or ugly, but always death crops up somewhere, somehow. So, in fact, does sex, but that's a whole different story. When we look at Shang tombs, dogs are ever present, either as sacrificial tomb fill or else in their specialized role in the waste pit or on the tomb ledge. The exact ritual significance is unclear, but it is clear that the dogs were ritually significant. This started as our baseline. The tomb underwent several structural and conceptual shifts by the turn of the 1st century CE. it came to be populated by ceramic figurines, limited in scope at first, then widely diversified. As tombs became more and more grand, comprising multiple chambers, grave goods also became more complex, reflecting the burgeoning of private estates amassed by landowners. These sources of sustenance, income, and entertainment were guarded by small ceramic dogs, and larger harness dogs were placed in the tomb chamber. While perhaps guarding the tomb much as the Yao dog once had, these ceramic dogs were not ritually significant, but were secular and pragmatic. Guarding the property amassed in the tomb, the prevalence of property in all senses of the word as a concern when constructing tombs becomes far clearer. So too does the occasional inclusion of hunting hounds in elite tombs, which articulates underlying conversations about dominion, political and animal, and this relevance in constructing and summarizing one's identity. But it's when we turn to the burial of dogs in their own right that we see an otherwise hidden shift in the appraisal of the animal. As the place of humans in the natural order was brought into question in the post-Han period, the dog emerged as a parallel for the loyal servant in life as well as in death, challenging and complementing canine motivations from being sinister to being humanized, moral, and worthy of reward. Far from being a reflection of the master's frugality or status, the dog came to earn its burial as reward for its moral fiber and superhuman devotion. This deep sentimentality and pathos is echoed later with the story of Patches, a beloved lapdog owned in the 8th century by Madame Lu. When the dog is killed, a series of hijinks ensue that result in Madame Lu traveling to the underworld and being saved from premature death by her beloved Patches, now a beautiful woman herself. Returning to life, Madame Lu finds the dog's bones and buries them. We may be tempted to see this in the same vein as Black Dragon and Yellow Ears, as reward for an act of heroism and morality. However, Madame Lu then buries Patches with the rights of a child, speaking to a far deeper sentimentality and emotional resonance that would otherwise go unnoticed in studies of human-dog relationships, and that is only visible through the medium of the tomb. Thank you so much for your time today, as I've sped through so many centuries, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, absolutely kind of engrossed. I don't know everyone else in the room as well. So please, if anyone has any questions for Kelsey, now's the chance. Anyone want to go? Go on, yes.
Question, probably won't be able to answer.
Sure.
Yes.
Mm.
The early dogs look rather like pit bulls.
Mm. Unfortunately, there's very little zooarchaeological analysis of the actual bones at the moment. We find the bones and then very little is done with them, except for maybe aging them. The problem with breeds is that they only extend back a very short way. They seem to be kind of similar to like the chow dog. They were likely, at least from the depictions, they seem quite bulky with a lot of kind of like short tufty fur and a little curled tail on their back. But they all seem very, very similar. But there's been very little work to compare any dog skeletons we do have with the ceramic figurines to see if they actually match. So unfortunately, we're not any closer to figuring out any of these dogs' breeds at the moment.
Neighbouring culture. Most of
Yeah, it's
dogs of the.
yes, yeah. Absolutely. It's so overlooked with dogs in the Han Dynasty. When we look at the Shang and the Zhou, there's so much analysis of the dog bones, at least on the age and the size. But when we turn to the Han, there's not even been that much work on the ceramics in the first place, let alone trying to actually do some zooarchaeological work and compare the figurines. So we're no closer on that one, but I hope someone will be able to figure that out. Someone better equipped than me.
Can I just follow up quickly on
Sure.
that? You said comparatively on the Han period, there'd be
Yes.
much less put on why?
I don't know.
So there's no obvious straightforward explanation for why that's being not looked at.
It's really surprising. I'm not really sure why the Han Dynasty and especially the dog ceramics, which are so frequently seen. I mean, you go into any museum with an art collection, there is a Chinese dog easily there. But for some reason, it's just been completely overlooked. I don't personally know of any studies that have specifically focused on the ceramic dogs or what they're doing or what they mean. I think it's because they're so ubiquitous. They've just kind of been unnoticed and just kind of taken for granted and maybe just kind of collected in general talk about minty and grave goods and maybe not seen as a specific line of inquiry on their own. Yes. Yes, let me go back to that. I'm very quick. All the way back here, which is the Zampa, this one. Yes, which fabric are you mentioning? The lowest one, I see. Yes, so this was obviously from the Zampa tool. They've had real trouble dating this piece. They think it could have been originally produced by Zhou Feng in the 9th, 10th century, but it was remade into a hand scroll rather than being screen inserts in the 11th century during the Song dynasty. Yes, yes. So if it was from the Tang dynasty, this isn't very surprising. We have lots of representations of women in Central Asian textiles. There are finds at Turfan, for instance, of actual textiles with rondelles on and things like that. So this isn't particularly unusual for the Tang. The question with this piece is whether it really was a Tang production or whether they're trying to do a pastiche of it. So, but it is a really beautiful painting, and this is only one section. There's 3 other sections to the painting, and the women are all very lavishly decorated with a whole range of textiles. It's difficult to tell. There certainly are still burials of dogs within some hand tombs, and we know from the regency of Wang Mang that he used sacrifices of dogs when there were not enough deer, I think it was. He used dogs still in sacrificial ceremonies. So there was certainly a continuation of some of these aspects, but it seems to have just petered out, as it were. I'm not really sure why. They don't tell us these things in text, which is a bit of frustrating, but it seems to have just faded out. But it was not a total replacement in the Han Dynasty. There were still sometimes dog burials, but very rare.
Can I ask a slightly awkward sounding question? I'm not quite sure how to put it without sounding too awkward. Obviously, you focus on a certain part of the world, although obviously over, as you said, many centuries.
Yeah, a long time.
And then Susan over there kind of broadened the scope a little bit to think about neighbouring areas, and you said sheepdogs. But I just wonder, because I know nothing obviously about what you've been exploring today.
Yes.
How does that how do we locate these insights in relation to the broader picture of, let's say, dogs and death? I mean, I just wonder, we can think of sort of anecdotal examples from other cultures at other times, but I just wondered how you, in a way, place this more broadly.
It's really difficult because there are obviously, we can think quite quickly of examples of like Kerberos in the underworld and Anubis and all these kind of things where dogs are positioned with death. Is that just a human inclination to think that dogs are associated with death? I mean, even the Sagdid ritual where the dog stares at the body in Zoroastrianism, there's lots of examples. I'm not really sure how this connects to the other cultures that do also perceive dogs in relation to death, and whether that is just a human inclination or a human reading. It's really hard to situate it. The only way I can situate it at present is just within the ritual culture of the tombs that I see. So in the Shang, for instance, it's very obvious that there was an overarching ritual agenda, not necessarily totally followed everywhere, but it was very much geographically constrained. So that's quite easy to situate the dog there. When we turn to, for instance, the representations of the dogs in tombs in the Han Dynasty, that's a lot more tricky because that can broaden out. I mean, the Greeks buried their dogs, the Romans buried their dogs. It's really difficult. I don't really know. I'd have to speak a lot of languages, I think, to be able to do it, to be able to actually really do it all as one person. You almost need a team.
But you need a team.
Yeah, you need a lot of money and a big team to be able to do that. But it would be great to do that because I feel like it's something that does come up in other cultures, and I'm surprised that more links haven't been made.
Yes, I think that raises questions that would be great.
Absolutely.
About eating dogs.
Yes, of course.
Still an issue in the
Yes.
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 My youngest daughter was for a while in another area which not actually right. Now. But so I visited walking in the street one morning. Look, I know I shouldn't have my breakfast here. To which she said, don't you sit there onto it? Oh, so
Oh.
clearly,
Yeah,
in some dog eating cultures, there are distinctions.
yes,
Edible dogs and non-edible dogs, but any sign of that?
yes.
Materials.
There is in one text, I'm really struggling to remember which text, that says there are, and it's an early Chinese one, I'm going to kick myself when I remember which one it is. It's not Feng Su Tong Yi, but it's something of this ilk, that says there are there are Shiquan, eating dogs, there are Shouquan, hunting dogs, and there are, I can't remember what they're called, Feiquan, barking dogs, guarding. So there is this idea that dogs played at least multiple roles. Could a dog be a hunting dog and then be an eating dog? This is open. I mean, in the Qin Dynasty statutes from Shui Di, dogs could move type. So a hunting dog could become an eating dog.
Yeah.
So there is that. In at least the Shang and the Zhou, they actually had potentially herds of dogs. And I know, very fun. There were these herds of dogs that were managed by a dog herder who would select the best ones for sacrificial rites if they had fine fur and were kind of fat and engorged. And if they were not so good, they would just be eaten. So there is this kind of ranking or stratification of dogs within a communal herd, but these would all have been intended for some kind of consumption, whether sacrificial or ordinary. But they were separate in some way. Whether this continued is not clear. There must have been certain breeds that would not have been, or types of dog that would not have been eaten. I'm thinking greyhounds and Salukis. You wouldn't eat it because it's worth too much. It's same with horses. Horse meat's not, I hope, not often consumed. It was in the Shang and the Zhou, but I'm pretty sure in France, yeah. But in China, at least, there's not that much that I know of about horse meat eating in like the Tang Dynasty and the Han Dynasty, because these animals were worth something somewhere else. So I think there were edible dogs. I think it was a porous category, but it was a category. So I agree with you on that. There was some kind of differentiation.
Okay, the other thing is yellow ears.
Yes.
I noticed that story in Richter's book about
Yes.
distillery practice. It occurs to me that it's not totally absurd, because we know that Grover's dogs will come down, you know, cross-country routes.
Yeah.
And so forth.
Yeah.
And apparently, when the drovers reached Smithfield, or where they were going, dogs were sent home.
Wow.
And the dogs did know the drovers' inns where they could stop and rest. Actually, one didn't want dogs in Smithfield, you know, while the drovers are, you know, selling and drinking. And so forth. And the dogs didn't.
Yeah.
So it is imaginable.
It's conceivable for sure. The thing is, I have no other similar stories of dogs delivering letters. This is the only one. Certainly dogs kind of roamed free, much like in Britain in the old days, we used to open your door and just let the dog out. This certainly was the case. We know in the Tang Dynasty that you could, for instance, if you had a dog that liked to bite people, you could get sued for that. If someone got injured, lawsuit's going to come against you. So you could put a sign up that says, my dog bites, don't go near it. And that means you couldn't get sued anymore. So we know the dogs somehow ranged free for people to be able to stumble on them and be bitten. But the letters I've not seen, which is surprising, I think, as well, because I think they have the capability for that. But I've not seen anything about it, only normally hunting, guarding.
The other thing that is
Yes.
was in the middle of the 19th century, every school is struggling in China. At one stage, their party picks up a dog.
Oh.
Sort of, they're traveling, and the dog is also traveling, doesn't stick with them.
Wow.
But it seems that the were dogs that were in the traveling with whatever party.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. I think they think the original domestication of the dog was sort of similar to this, where people had food and the dogs came and followed them, kind of thing. So it could be something. Yeah, it could have just followed them home. But they certainly had kind of wild-esque dogs that roamed free-ish. Yeah, it's unclear the ownership of that kind of dog in that case. A bit tricky. But absolutely.
When you say ownership,
Yeah,
that then makes you
that's
think of
a-
the value.
yes.
And I just wondered, if there any, I mean, things you talked about suggest that some of these animals had great value.
Yes.
Is there any way of kind of getting any, not precise, but more precise sense of how they stacked up in the kind of hierarchy of valuable things.
Absolutely. Certainly some hunting hounds were very, very prestigious. So obviously we're thinking the Saluki, if I can find him, this is where this always goes wrong. It really doesn't like me today. Go on, one more. Please, please, there we go.
Yeah.
So the Salukis are certainly very valuable dogs. And because they were also, these are all tomb figurines and a tomb mural. So this was clearly closely associated with someone's identity, and they probably owned these dogs. So the tomb mural from memory is from, I think it's from Prince Lucien. It's one of the princes, certainly of the early Tang dynasty. And they were obviously highly associated with the tribute of Saluki into the royal house. So that adds one line of ownership, is the tribute dogs. With the lap dogs, their specific owners. We've already seen Madame Lu was a specific named owner of this dog. And all of the dogs I mentioned later on had a named owner. All the stories of a moral dog have a named owner, but all the stories of a bad dog don't have a named owner. So there's something to that. I think it's ownership is declared when the dog is worth declaring it in a way. And if not, they were more a household dog. So sometimes there's names like the dog that was raised by X person or belonged to X person's house, which is a little more abstract if it belongs to X person's house. They might have just been a dog that was just around in the courtyard. So varying degrees of ownership. Yeah. Ooh. I haven't been looking, honestly, but there probably must be. There must be recipes for dogs. The only thing I can think of is there's a special dog offering, which is where you, something like you boil the bones down into a jelly and it creates a gelatinous stew called gongxian, which is the main offering you would make of a dog. So there must be other recipes. They can't be the only one. But I haven't come across them yet. I will keep an eye out. I won't try them out though, but I'll keep an eye out.
Okay, well, maybe there are no more questions on that rather uncomfortable note. We could, well, thank you very much again, Kelsey.
Thank
We
you,
could just thank her again for her talks. And yeah, thank you so much. And I hope that the research that you're now doing as part of your postdoc is
Yes.
being as fascinating as what you've.
Horses, totally another, totally another animal, but yes,
Yeah,
but still good fun.
good fun. Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And yes, when you come back again and Alison's going to go out for food, we're not going anywhere with
With
anything.
dog.
No, no,
Thank you.
I know.
It's just so frustrating because one wants to look at
You wanted to get into it all, I know.